Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with everyone again. I'm particularly interested in this issue of the education system and how children with FASD can best succeed in that system. And today, having Ron Powell with us to guide the discussion makes it all the more exciting. I am not going to take much time. This is going to be mainly Dr. Powell, but I want to review just a couple of principles with you that are at the basis of this conversation. Number one, we have been discussing in previous webinars and in previous work we've done the issue of information processing and how any individual takes information and uses it. Now, remember, there are 4 steps: input, bringing the information in; integration, interpreting that information so that it makes sense; memory, storing the information; and output, how you use that information to guide your behavior. And this is something we've talked about many times, and each point in this information processing approach, each point, input, integration, memory, output, is affected. The part of the brain responsible for each of those steps, that part of the brain is affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. And so what you get is the picture of the child, the adolescent, the young person with prenatal alcohol exposure affected in 3 different arenas: neurocognitive functioning, which is mainly memory, executive functioning; self-regulation, the ability to regulate yourself, not only motorically, your motor regulation, but also your emotional regulation; and then adaptive functioning, the ability to take skills and apply them to daily living. So these are the 3 areas that we've discussed before that are affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. And they translate into a clinical presentation that very much looks like ADHD, with impulsive behavior, poor attention, distractibility, overactivity. But what differentiates children with prenatal alcohol exposure from children with ADHD is the profound executive functioning deficits and the regulatory deficits, especially the regulation of emotions. So our question today now is, well, how does that translate into the academic setting? You see difficulties with abstraction, memory, slow processing speed, impaired judgment, difficulty with cause and effect thinking, and problems with temporal reasoning. So those are the main issues that we've asked Dr. Powell to talk about. Now, one caveat I want you to be sure to understand: we're not talking about treating FASD or making accommodations specific to FASD per se, but we're talking about addressing the secondary characteristics that are grounded in the neurobiological changes that are induced by prenatal alcohol exposure. So none of this information that I've presented so far is new. This is what we've been talking about over this webinar series for the last 2 years. But now we want to turn our attention to the school setting, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce a good friend and colleague and someone I respect greatly for his ability to understand FASD within the school setting, Dr. Ron Powell. So, Ron, I'm going to hand this over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and it is certainly a pleasure to be a part of this very important discussion on the impact of fetal alcohol spectrum, what I call fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or children who are on the fetal alcohol spectrum, and how that looks in schools, what those specific behavioral deficits look like, and how that impacts learning. And so our ability to even have this discussion probably is pretty unique. In a search of most of the literature, we find that there are very few studies that have actually been conducted to give us insight into what works in the classroom. So I'm pleased to be able to be a part of this discussion today, and I'm hoping that as a result of this dialogue that we'll be able to come to some conclusions about how we can better serve children who are adversely impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure. The biggest question, of course, for most of us winds up being, how do the behavioral deficits that are exhibited by children who have been prenatally alcohol exposed, how does that affect both school and learning? And the answer to that is really relatively simple, because the fact of the matter is that most of these kids are very challenging to school personnel. FASD is not a category that is common to school individuals. What they see is they see a child who's acting out. They see a child who perhaps has difficulty in gaining meaning from the information that's presented in the classroom. And they might interpret that as being, well, the child just isn't paying attention. Or they might interpret it from the standpoint that perhaps the child lacks the will or the motivation to learn. He could really get it because he seems to be attending, but on the other hand, when I ask him the questions, he doesn't come back with the right answers, even though it's a part of the discussion that we just had. And they don't see that as being all symptomatic of the central nervous system disorders that are common to children who've been prenatally exposed. So they may interpret it as being just simple disruption in the classroom, or maybe just the fact that the child is a slow learner. And the fact of the matter is that most educators, they lack the resources to be able to gain insight into how best to serve this population. There are very few people out there that are actually talking about the educational impact that fetal alcohol exposure has on the learning behaviors of a child in the classroom. So when we look at the amount of resources that are available, we find a disconnect between the information and what actually goes on in the classroom. In a study that was conducted by Ryan and Ferguson, they did a qualitative analysis of 5 children who fell on the fetal alcohol spectrum in Alaska. And they went in and they interviewed school people about how they felt about their capacity to serve these children that were in the classroom. And one of the comments that was made by one of the teachers was that they had people that came in from the outside because it was part of a larger project that all studied the impact of fetal alcohol exposure on children across their lifespan. And so they had consultants that came and they conducted training and they talked about the impact of the delays that they saw in the brain and how that impacted learning. And the teacher said, but they give us ideas and I go back to my classroom and most of those ideas I can't use. Because teachers are faced with the issue of having to address all 35 kids in the classroom, not the 1 or 2 who may be fetal alcohol exposed. And with the frustration of having to change the manner in which they instruct, if they can't visualize themselves actually using those concepts in the classroom, they'll go back to what they're used to. And that means typically exposing children to learning in such a way that it doesn't maximize the strengths that a child who is on the fetal alcohol spectrum has and be able to facilitate their learning in this process. So they also not only lack the information and training, but the research also showed that experienced teachers take this all in stride. They're used to educating students who have learning differences in the classroom. In fact, what the research shows is that between the lowest performing child in a typical classroom and the highest performing child in a typical classroom, you may have 5 or 6 grade levels difference. And so teachers are already used to dealing with a heterogeneous population of students. But inexperienced teachers have a very limited set of strategies that they can employ. And as a result, they get much more frustrated with the child who isn't learning in the traditional way, and they're also much more likely not to adapt their instruction. The task, I think, for us in education winds up being to explain the deficits that a child who falls on the fetal alcohol spectrum, what those deficits are, what it looks like in the classroom, and give examples of how classroom instruction can be modified in ways that are simple enough for most teachers to be able to incorporate into their instructional strategies. So the next question winds up being, what does fetal alcohol spectrum behaviors look like in the school setting? And then what strategies can be used? And let me give a caveat on this as well, because as I explained, there's very little research that has actually been done specifically in this area. And so the best that we can do is take a look at the functioning of a child who falls on the spectrum, take a look at that functioning in terms of the behavioral manifestations that are seen in the classroom, and then make connections with what we do know from the research and draw behavioral strategies that can be used in the classroom that will make the proper accommodations. Now, there are a couple of areas of executive functioning that I think would be important for us to take a look at. We know, for example, from the research, it's very clear that children who fall on the fetal alcohol spectrum, experience deficits in executive functioning. And executive functioning has to do with things like problem-solving behavior and concept formation and fluency and attention, but it also has to do with working memory. And so I'm going to start there, because there are a couple of aspects of working memory that have unique implications for the ways that we can adjust instruction to make it more accessible to students who fall on the fetal alcohol spectrum. Working memory has been called by Ashcraft as the mental scratch pad, because working memory has to do with being able to hold units of information in your head long enough to be able to manipulate them, to be able to guide decision making. And so, for example, those units of information might be words or concepts that we need to be able to compare and contrast or judge which one is the better option to take. And children who fall on the fetal alcohol spectrum typically have great difficulty in doing this. In fact, Kadatu Waku has pointed out that the deficits in working memory are so substantive that they may explain much of the cognitive impairments that we see in children who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And in fact, Burden has pointed out that if you control for IQ, the extent of deficit that remains with children who fall on the spectrum winds up being substantively more than can be explained by low cognitive functioning in and of itself. So let's take a look at a couple of the different ways that executive functioning manifests itself here with working memory. And the first that I want to talk about has to do with verbal working memory. And verbal working memory is, of course, as you all know, it's exactly what it says. It's working memory where you're holding words in mind to be able to make decisions about that. So the way that would look in the classroom winds up being difficulties, for example, in following multi-step directions. In a classroom, classrooms are typically run with a set of rules that students must attend to. So when a classroom teacher says, when you come into the classroom, I want you to put your book bag over by your cubby, and I want you to come to your desk and pull out your book and be prepared for learning, that's a multi-step direction. But if they also say, turn to page 28 and look at the diagram on the bottom right-hand side of the paper, and put your finger on the bubble to the left, now you've pretty much lost a child who's adversely impacted in this area. They can't hold that much information. They might look around and take cues from the guy sitting next to him. Which page did they say? Where did they say to put my finger? See, the processing of the sequences winds up being impacted by this deficit in verbal working memory. And it also affects, especially for adolescents at the secondary level, it affects their ability to draw conclusions on more formal stages of learning, such as cause and effect, and synthesis and analysis. Those kinds of processes are very common. Once you get into 7th grade and above, you change from a single teacher in a single classroom that you see at the elementary level who's teaching multiple subjects, and now you're going to a different teacher for every content area, and you're having to adjust to different modes of instruction and different content sections as well. And those contents, that whether it's history or math or science, those content areas are very rich in terms of their word lists, their specific vocabulary, and the concepts that have to be learned by the child. So, what can a teacher do in that regard? Well, one thing that they can do winds up being they can break information into smaller units. You can see that Matson pointed out that retention rates are very similar among children who've been prenatally exposed and their typical peers when you control the number of words that are presented. It's the long lists that wind up being difficult for a child with FASD. If you shorten that down and give it in smaller increments, then a child with FASD has a much simpler task ahead of them. Another point is that P has shown that children with FASD have demonstrated outstanding recall of information if you embed that information within context, which means you put it into stories, as opposed to lists. Now that's a very interesting finding. Don't we all learn better if we actually know why we're learning the information? It's not just supposed to be information that we reproduce, a vocabulary list, for example, or a list in science of the types of plants that, for example, might fall within a particular species or phylum. See, those kinds of learning activities are difficult for a child with fetal alcohol. But it isn't that education is populated this way with those types of instructional strategies, because early on in early education, kindergarten teachers and preschool teachers have done this quite often. This is a typical kindergarten class, and here the teacher is doing what? She's using a story to reinforce concepts. Now, I happen to be a grandfather of 9 children, and so my wife has made her career teaching in preschool environments, and so I have been embedded in the whole curriculum for very young children. And I find that the use of stories to convey concepts is very rich in a preschool and early education environment. For some reason, we lose that capacity as we progress through the grades. Now you can notice that when you put information into context, that you can embed a lot of information into that context. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on when we talk about mnemonic strategies or memory strategies that have been shown to work very effectively for children who fall on the spectrum. Now let's move along and we go to working memory deficits, which is the next slide. And here we have visual spatial working memory, which has to do with memory for objects and shapes. Now we know that children who are prenatally alcohol exposed have specific problems in the area of numeracy and estimation, that math is a difficult area for them. And it's primarily related to this deficit in visual spatial working memory. So things like word problems, for example, pose a unique area of difficulty for a child who falls on the fetal alcohol spectrum. And they also have difficulty with interpreting facial expressions for the same reason. They can't hold what the facial expression looks like to connect with a specific emotion. They can't hold that in their heads long enough to be able to differentiate that within a context. Also, children with visual spatial memory problems have visual motor integration problems as well, which means that when you look up at the board in the classroom, it's difficult to see what's going on in the front of the classroom and be able to translate that back to the paper that's in front of you. So one of the accommodations that can be made winds up being using concrete manipulatives, for example, for a child who falls on the spectrum. So if we look at the next slide, what you'll see is that the research by Euchre and Nadel have shown that in a memory for objects task, that children who are prenatally alcohol exposed remembered the same number of objects as typical peers. Now this was a task where they laid a number of objects out, they covered it up with a cloth, and then they removed the cloth for a period of time, allowed the child to take a look at the objects, covered it back up again, and asked them to remember it. But what implication does that have for us in the classroom? It means that a child's ability to recognize objects or visual aids winds up being an area that we might be able to draw upon to prepare lessons that are more accessible for a child who falls on the spectrum. So the use of concrete manipulatives, for example, in math, the use of poker chips or of beans or something that a child can actually maneuver in order to gain a better sense of numeracy becomes vitally important. If we can structure the classroom in such a way, for example, where we create graphs, instead of asking the child to measure a specific length of a line, perhaps what we would want to do would be to put the measuring tape up on the wall, and then a child is able to look around and find objects in the classroom that they can then gauge, well, how many things do we have in the classroom that are 3 foot tall or that are 2 foot tall? That ability to actually use a hands-on approach to the discovery of math concepts is going to be much more powerfully effective with children who fall on the fetal alcohol spectrum. We might also want to minimize the assignments that they're required to copy. When you look at the board, many teachers put today's assignment or perhaps even the week's assignment on the board, and we ask children to copy that down onto their paper in their notebooks so that they know what that looks like. Rules are commonly put on the board, but you need to understand that children who are prenatally exposed have difficulty with that, because by the time they look at the board and then look back on their paper, they've forgotten what it is that they're looking for. Now, other problems of executive functioning as we move forward is that problem solving and planning, for example, are also affected. And what does that look like in the classroom? It means that children are going to be much more likely to give a very quick response. Typically in a classroom, you'll see hands shoot up all over the classroom, and when you call on a child who's perhaps been prenatally alcohol exposed, that child doesn't actually have the answer. They shot their hand up first before they actually came up with the answer to the question that the teacher was posing. This is not uncommon for these children. And not only that, but the research shows that once they've learned a strategy, they're very reluctant to give up on it. They persist in giving the wrong response, even when given feedback that isn't the way that you do the problem, or no, you're thinking about something different. And in order to get to the end result, they might perhaps resort to violating the rules. We see this commonly in the lunch line, where a child knows the rule that you go to the end of the line, that you don't take cuts in the line, and yet they're overwhelmed by the fact that they know Johnny, who's halfway up the line already, and they'll go stand next to Johnny because they're thinking that their acknowledgement of that relationship that they have with that person kind of trumps the rule. The violation of rules occurs in the classroom as well. It's oriented toward trying to get an outcome without actually thinking through the sequence and the process that's necessary in order to get there in a legitimate way. Now, just a word, if I backstep for a moment, and that is that as we're going through working memory deficits and these other executive functioning deficits, we need to understand that these deficits are all integrated together. They're not distinct. We don't usually see a verbal memory, working memory deficit in isolation from a visual spatial working memory deficit in isolation from a problem-solving deficit. They all wind up being combined, and many times the behaviors that you see for a child who falls on the spectrum winds up being a combination of many of these kinds of executive functioning deficits that are all combined together. So while we're breaking them apart and giving ideas for how you get around unique aspects of it, we also need to keep in mind that that's not the reality within a classroom. This is much more complicated than the simplistic presentation that I'm trying to give today. So we have a child who has problem solving and planning difficulties. They will oftentimes complete the task quickly, but of course there are many mistakes because they don't go back and review the work, or their object is to get done, not to gain meaning while they're doing it. Another executive functioning problem that we face is the problem with concept formation and what's called set shifting. And this is similar in some ways to the planning deficits that we just talked about. Here we have the difficulty in shifting strategies in response to the feedback. And so, for example, with a young girl that we recently worked with, She had learned the strategy of reading words by sounding them out. Now, fortunately, she didn't have a deficit in auditory processing, and so she was able to replicate the sounds of individual phonemes. So A is ah, and B is ba, 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 ba. And she knew that, and she knew all of the sounds of her letters. But her approach to reading was very logical, sequential, and mechanistic. And so when she came to the word the, she laboriously sounded it out, individual letter by letter. But the is a word that is best learned by sight, because the TH sound, that blend sound, doesn't lend itself well to When you sound out the individual letters, it doesn't get you to the same spot. And yet that's the strategy that she used. And even in a short sentence, like the boy jumped, the boy ran, in 2 sentences close together, 3-word sentences, when she hit the second the, she did exactly the same strategy that she used with the first the. She sounded it out letter by letter, even though those 2 words were only separated 4 words apart. See, she didn't shift in her strategy, having understood how to do it the first time, to move toward actually being able to remember what that word was so that she could replicate it. That's a strategy shift problem. And they also have difficulty with abstract concepts, forms of government, for example, numbers and quantities, even emotional states like what's it feel like to be embarrassed or patient. They can see that in themselves, but they oftentimes have a theory of mind problem as well, which means that they can't see those emotional states in others, which means that they have difficulty with the empathy part of it. And all of that has to do with the concept formation difficulties. So what can we do about inhibitory control? If we take a look at the problems associated with inhibitory control, here we see that lack of empathy once again coming up. If we move to the next slide, you can see that, for example, in a very tight classroom, you'll have kids who are actually seated very closely together. And as one child begins to progress down the aisle between the desks, he may brush against a child who has been prenatally exposed, and the interpretation of that child is, he hit me. He doesn't recognize that perhaps it was an accident. And so they jump to the conclusion that something nefarious was actually going on, as opposed to perhaps an accidental brush-off. This relates then to the poor self-regulation that we often see with children who fall in the fetal alcohol spectrum, and the inability to regulate their emotions, and the difficulty that they have with picking up on social cues and being able to relate well to others. All of that relates back to this inhibitory control issue. And we're going to talk more about that in just a minute when we address the notion of attention deficits in a little bit more detail. But in a typical classroom with children working together, you can see that oftentimes they're very closely together working on a common project. And if you bump up against another and you have difficulty determining whether or not that bump was intentional, you can see how disruptive this can be to the classroom. Now let's move on to development of social skills problems, which are also very common with children who fall on the fetal alcohol spectrum. And here we have those problems with social experiences. Now, we can deal with that in a social setting, because you can't learn to get along well with others unless you actually practice that within the context of getting along well with others. And so the opportunities that are presented to give social stories, like we saw with Pete the cat, and even with adolescents, there are similar kinds of social stories that adolescents can be engaged in that teach them the proper way to interact. That discourse has to do with being able to say something, stand back and listen, reflect off of what the other person says, and offer another point in terms of the conversation. All of those are social rules that sometimes just fly right over the head of a child who has been prenatally alcohol affected. So the opportunity to engage in interactive play. For many children, for example, when they feel violated, they will act out because they don't know the words to use to actually be able to express their displeasure. In those cases, it's important for us to give children scripts. Rather than hit, you simply say, "Stop it, I don't like that." If you give a child the script and give them the opportunity to practice it, it becomes a much easier task in terms of behavior control. Cooperative group work, for example, provides the opportunity, like we saw in the last picture, of children working together on a common project. And in that social environment of working together on a common project, we see the benefits of learning these social interaction skills. And that also means that cross-age tutoring becomes a very effective strategy. When you bring older kids into the classroom to assist younger children with skill deficits, there is an interaction that they learn from being able to interact with normal age role models, and we see great benefits in terms of the research literature for how all of that works. In the next area, what I want to talk about is the role of the hippocampus in terms of memory, because this then gives us some ideas for how we might move forward in terms of devising instructional strategies that work for children who've been prenatally alcohol exposed. The hippocampus has been called the gateway to long-term memory. And essentially, the hippocampus has been found to be very sensitive to novelty. It searches the environment for things that are novel. See, our brains forget the things that are routine, even though our senses are commonly bringing in that kind of information in a continuous stream. So, for example, in my house, I have an old regulator clock. It was produced around the early, 20th century, and it's very loud. It's all totally mechanical, and it goes tick-tock, tick-tock in a very loud sound, and on the hour and on the half hour, it gongs in a loud way. And when we moved into our house for lack of space of where to put this antique, we decided, and I'm not sure whose idea this was, but we decided that it would probably be a good idea if we would hang it in the master bedroom. And so when people come into my house and it's close to the half hour or the hour, they hear this sound and they say, "Where is that clock?" And I'll say, "It's in my master bedroom." And they look at me with confusion and they say, "How in the world do you sleep?" And the real answer to that is, well, I didn't for about 2 weeks. And after that, my brain recognized that that clock was a normal fixture in my house, and I totally forgot about the tick-tock. I don't even hear it anymore. And in fact, I wake up now when I forget to wind the clock and it stops in the middle of the night. The lack of the sound wakes me up. Now that's the way that we typically act. That's the function of the hippocampus. It searches for novelty. It helps us to decide which things that are routine in our world to ignore and which things we should particularly pay attention to. And that becomes an important learning tool, because it turns out that those things that are novel in our environment, like rhyme and rhythm and song and humor, they're not common. And so the hippocampus picks up on that quickly. And if it does pick up on that, it also serves then as a trigger for perhaps being able to access longer-term memory. And we'll show you how that works in just a little bit. So if we go back then and we take a look at how we might use the novelty-seeking aspects of the hippocampus, it gives us some ideas on what we might be able to do in terms of learning. We can use transition elements to assist children in being able to regulate their behavior as we move from one activity to another in the classroom. Because of the set shifting problem that children who fall in the spectrum have, they typically wind up being agitated when you move from one activity level to another within a classroom. But if you give a child an advanced organizer of that, then it assists the child in recognizing, okay, it's time to move to this next activity. It gives them a chance to be able to adjust their affect, to control their arousal level to the point where they can make that shift more naturally. Transition elements, for example, might be things like playing of a tone. Some teachers use a little chime in the classroom, and they signal the readiness to move to another activity by hitting the chime button. I've seen other teachers that will use their iPod to play a little segment of music. And as the music begins to well up in the background, it gets children ready for shifting from the activity that they're currently working on to the next set of activities. Or perhaps it's physical movement in the class. Some way of being able to signal that will make it easier on the child who typically finds that type of movement and change in activity disruptive in the classroom. Another thing we can do is we can assist with self-regulation with a sense of humor. And I have to caution here, because some people don't use humor very well. Some people just should not use this strategy. But others, they wind up being able to use it very effectively to defuse tense situations with just enough humor. You throw enough novelty into the situation that it distracts from the emotional moment, and it brings a child back to a point where they can bring their emotional level back down again. We can also use the reinforcement of instructional elements with music, like we saw with Pete the Cat, the combination of the novelty of the music back behind that story. I mean, when a teacher is actually reading that story, she doesn't have that. But the little song that is sung, I like my white shoes, I like my white shoes, that kind of song winds up being catchy. If you've ever been to Disneyland and have gone through It's a Small World, you recognize how a short little ditty that is put to music can actually become demonic. You will sing that song in your head for days afterwards because you have the nature of its repetition placed with the song. It just makes it easier for the brain to grab a hold of it. Why is it so much easier for children to learn the alphabet, for example, with the alphabet song? So much so that when you ask them a question like, what's the letter that precedes P? They might have to sing the song to get to O in order to be able to answer that question. So we wind up seeing that music, when you use it in combination with learning, that it is an important and a powerful tool. You can't do it all the time, of course. Not everything can be put to music, but there are many aspects that can be. So let's take a look at what that looks like in terms of arousal and attention deficits and what that means for children who fall on the fetal alcohol spectrum. You know, it's been estimated that between 60 and 70% of children who have fetal alcohol exposure also have the characteristics of attention deficit and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Males seem to be affected much more powerfully than females. The normal incidence of attention deficit within the typical population is about a 2-to-1 ratio of males to females, but within the FASD population, the fetal alcohol exposed population, males are about 3 times more likely than females to have the manifestations of attention deficit disorder. And we find from the work from Coles and Mattson and others that the deficits in attention are not global. They seem to be more affecting the visual area, so those deficits in the visual sustained attention seems to be much more deleterious than deficits in auditory attention, for example. So how does that affect the child? If we look at the next slide, we can see that it affects their vigilance, their reaction time, and their information processing. And there are some researchers who believe that the attention deficit with children who've been prenatally alcohol exposed is more a matter of poor arousal and self-regulation than it is a matter of sustained attention. And I'm going to show you that in just a second, because the ability to focus and sustain attention on an object, that depends upon our ability to regulate arousal. And we know that children who fall in the fetal alcohol spectrum have difficulty with self-regulation. And so that inefficient processing of information that we see within the environment has been shown to bring a child's emotional level up to a point where it's difficult for them to actually sustain attention on the task. They seem to be overwhelmed by features within the environment. So what's one of the statements, for example, that we might use to characterize this mindset? it is kind of a general rule that slower processing speed of the brain seems to be overwhelmed by this constant barrage of environmental stimuli. Our inability to make sense of our environment then actually serves to distract us from paying attention to important elements. Typical classrooms are very distracting. Classroom structure is such that it's not uncommon for us to take a look at trying to create an enriched environment by putting pictures on the walls and hanging examples of student work and student projects, as you see from this picture. And so then the question comes up, is an attention deficit disorder as manifested by a child who's been prenatally alcohol exposed, is that substantively different than an attention deficit disorder that we see with a normal population? This question was actually addressed by Coles et al. And what they did was they looked at the characteristics of an attention deficit disorder for a non-alcohol affected group versus the attention deficit disorder for children who've been prenatally alcohol exposed. And they used Mirsky's 4-factor profile, which was the elements of focus, sustain, encode, and shift. And they found that sure enough that there was a difference between these two populations. Children who have an attention deficit disorder who have not been adversely impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure have greater difficulty with focusing their attention on a task and then sustaining that attention level once they're there. They exhibit the inhibitory control, for example, and they also have greater difficulty with retrieval. But children who've been fetal alcohol exposed and have the manifestations of attention have greater difficulty with encoding the information. It isn't that they can't focus on an object, it is that they can't retain it long enough in working memory for it to make sense to them. And so as a result, they wind up being unable to sustain attention over a period of time because they can't remember the content that was just presented. When you put that together with the problem that they have with shifting attention and shifting focus from one point to another, you can see what that actually will look like in the classroom setting. That flexibility in problem solving winds up being a deficit. They're used to doing it a certain way. They can't think of themselves doing it in another way. And they as well exhibit the inhibitory control problems. So this can be addressed if we take a look at breaking up visual information into smaller segments. Because remember that a child who's been prenatally alcohol exposed particularly has trouble with sustained attention to visual information. But we don't see that same thing with sustained attention to auditory information. Coles et al. And Mattson found that auditory attention is a relative strength for a child who's been prenatally alcohol exposed. So we might choose to, for example, try to limit the environmental distractions, those visual aspects around the child, to help them or to assist them in focusing more on the lesson. And we could probably benefit from using the mnemonic strategies, which once again, wait for it, I'll talk to you about that in just a second. But they can probably benefit from using the mnemonic strategies to enhance encoding since they have the short-term memory problems. Crocker found that children with FASD and ADHD, they have great difficulty with encoding information, and of course we know that that's a common characteristic. So another conclusion that can be drawn from this, if we move to the next slide, is that inefficient learning strategies, now together with the deficits in attention, they form an inability to filter out that extraneous sensory input, primarily visual in nature, through concentration. And if you can't concentrate on it, then that complicates the efforts of the child to learn. Now let's talk about social dysfunction just for a second. The role of social relationships cannot be understated because we find that children who have been prenatally alcohol exposed, their executive functioning is compromised by emotional state. So social relationships, they wind up increasing in terms of the complexity with which we have to deal with. In interacting with others, we have the generalization, the abstraction problems, that problem-solving deficits. They all come to play when we're interacting with others. And so we have to learn those conventions of how do you properly interact with others, and how do you establish friendships, and how do you take into account the affect of others in working with them. You know, the feelings that you have for yourself don't necessarily belong to the same feelings that others are holding. And so children who've been prenatally alcohol exposed, sometimes they'll experience depression because of that social isolation that they feel in the context of having peers and friends within the learning environment. And that can bring about some sense of low self-esteem or anxiety in social settings that they'll need to cope with. If we move on to the next area, which is supportive relationships, you can see that Dreiskouth has found that a protective factor against the adverse lifetime events that are common in the lives of children who have been prenatally alcohol exposed. And we're talking about trouble with the law, inappropriate sexual activity, imprisonment, those kinds of adverse lifetime events. A protective factor against those winds up being early placement into a stable and loving and supportive environment. Now, I want to stop for a second and just focus on that. Because if you're talking about a warm and supportive environment, you're talking about surrounding a child who falls on the fetal alcohol spectrum with people who actually genuinely care for them, are interested in their welfare, and for whom that child knows that they actually like them. Now, this is not uncommon. Once again, going back to the research by Ryan and Ferguson, they found that teachers often express the fact that they genuinely liked the child who was prenatally alcohol exposed, even though they found their behavior to be troublesome in the classroom. And that turned out to be true as well in the work that was conducted by Dreiskouth in 1997, when they found that a protective factor against disruptive school experiences, such as multiple suspensions and expulsions and dropout behaviors, was whether or not the child felt that there was somebody that they had connected with on the school site that believed that they believed truly cared about them. So if we look at the role of relationships, it winds up being a protective factor against adverse behavioral outcomes for the child. If we tie that together with the work that has been done by Kadatowaku, you can see that stress compromises the executive functioning. And it's believed to work by means of the mechanism that cognitive resources wind up being diverted from the task of the regulation of arousal. And so when you're upset, you know this to be true, when you're upset, you can't think. The worst time in the world to try to make an executive decision about anything is when your emotional levels are high. For a child who's been prenatally alcohol exposed, that problem is made even worse because of the deficits that a child has in terms of their central nervous system processing for being able to draw from multiple answers to come to a best conclusion. In this picture of the next classroom, frequent monitoring of the work by a teacher who is demonstrating to the student that they genuinely care about them, this moving around in the classroom, this paying attention to the personal needs of individuals, the touch of the hand on the shoulder, the calm, reassuring approach to "you can do this," this all makes a difference in terms of the learning readiness for the child. So if we look at what can be done in that regard, then it stands to reason that teachers should take time to try to build rapport with the child with FASD, because it's going to improve their capacity to learn. We definitely should create the classroom space itself as a safe place and not allow bullying behavior or put-downs in the classroom. And we should allow the use of peer tutoring in the classroom, because that allows us to address the social interaction so that a child feels better about the relationships that they have with others under the watchful supervision, guidance, and direction of the teacher that can actually guide those interactions in a way that are supportive. So, what resources are available to the student who has a prenatal alcohol exposure? And we've looked to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act as perhaps an option for placement of a child, but a child who falls on the fetal alcohol spectrum doesn't easily fit into any of the 13 disability categories that we see that are covered under the IDEA. So for example, in intellectual disability is defined as a two-part test under IDEA, and that is significant sub-average general intellectual functioning, but it has to occur concurrently with deficits in adaptive behavior. And typically that level of significant sub-average general intellectual functioning is judged to be an IQ of less than 70. Now, some states have an IQ cutoff at 80, some states at 85. Most states use an IQ cutoff around 70. The problem with that is that most kids who fall on the fetal alcohol spectrum have IQ levels that are much higher than that. And so, not much higher, but in the 80s. And so the difficulty is they don't fall cleanly into this category. So let me go to the next slide and I can show you. This is the distribution of disabilities within the United States broken out by disability. And you can see that that population, the little violet-colored square that's up there around the 2 o'clock, between the 1 o'clock and the 2 o'clock space on this chart, that's students with intellectual disability and multiple disabilities. Those students wind up being a relatively small proportion of the total population of students who fall into the categories that are accepted by IDEA. There's 6% who are emotionally disturbed. There are 11% of these students who fall in the category of other health impaired, which, by the way, probably is the category that most FASD children might fall into, because the other health impaired category is the category where ADD and ADHD is recognized. If we get to the LD category, which represents more than a third of the total population of students with disabilities, the LD category requires processing deficits. Okay, we can check that box off. Students who have prenatal alcohol exposure definitely have processing deficits. But you have to genuinely have a difference between IQ level and academic functioning. And there we wind up with a much flatter profile on children with fetal alcohol spectrum, and that's the difficulty in falling into the LD category. So what categories might they fall into? Perhaps LD, certainly OHI. If their cognitive level is deficient enough, perhaps into the intellectual disability category. Many of these kids have language deficits. They might fall in the category of speech and language impairment. But here's the deal. The identification of a disability does not guarantee that a teacher is going to adapt their instruction to meet the needs of a child who falls on the alcohol spectrum. And that's the problem. It isn't place that makes the difference. It's what we do with the child once they get into the place that makes the difference. And so quickly, let me just address what it looks like to have strategies that address the needs of kids who fall on the fetal alcohol spectrum. This is a list of research-proven strategies. Now, these strategies, if we look at the top, have been shown to be effective by the work of Lloyd, Furness, and Cavalli, and Furness and Cavalli in a book that they wrote, a monograph that was published by the Association of Children with Intellectual Disabilities. And they found that there are some typical strategies that are used in the classroom that are not effective at all. Now, the scale that goes along the bottom of this horizontal bar chart is a scale of effect size. And effect size is a z-score, if you remember your typical distribution that we see in the bell curve, for example. And you all remember from your initial statistics class that a z-score can be, translated into a percentile rank, and all of that is like, oh my goodness, don't take us through those statistics. And so here's the best way to interpret this. The best way to interpret this is months of growth in an academic year. So let's look at what is typically used that is not effective. Look up there on the far left-hand side toward the top. Modality-based instruction. That's, I'm a visual learner, I'm an auditory learner. I had one parent tell me, I finally figured out what my child is. He's a gustatory learner. I said, good grief, what's that? She says, he learns by taste. I said, sign me up. If I can learn my lessons by eating them, that's the class I want to be engaged in. But we find that modality-based instruction has very little impact in the actual learning of the child when used in the classroom. If you look down, they get about 2 months worth of academic growth. That's not very far in a regular school year. It's probably not the best way to spend our time. If you look for a little further down, you'll see class size. They say, well, I can't teach and individualize and differentiate instruction because I have such a large class. But class size, for example, has been shown to have very little impact between 10 and 40. Glass showed that below 10, you get a bump in academic performance. Above 40, you get a decrement. But between 10 and 40 in a classroom, pretty much not any difference whatsoever. And yet we're spending in California millions of dollars every year trying to reduce class size down to 20. Research shows doesn't work. Doesn't work. You get about 3 months worth of academic growth as a result of all of those expenditures, resources spent in reducing class size. So Cohen has established a rule of thumb that you need to have an effect size of at least 0.40 to even be considered to be effective. And what's in that group? Well, we look at peer tutoring, for example, which gives you an effect size of nearly 0.6 or 6 months growth with the use of peer tutoring. Early intervention, certainly, the faster we catch them, the more benefit that we can get. And look at the bottom group. As we get down above 0.60, those are the strategies that we want to use in classrooms. We have early intervention. We have formative evaluation, which is the frequent assessment of children's progress, and then falling back and reteaching, using repetition and intensity and frequency in order to reinforce the lesson. You have direct instruction, which is best characterized as I do, we do, you do, where the teacher demonstrates what needs to be done. She works cooperatively with the child in a system of scaffolded and supportive learning. And in that context, then you have a child who's actually able to learn because they're supported with learning, and once they reach the level of mastery, it's then and only then that they give them the chance to continue to practice that learning into a place where it becomes automatic. We know from the research that children who've been prenatally alcohol exposed do not have trouble with retrieval. Once they get the information into long-term memory, it's there. It's locked. They can go back and retrieve it. It's getting it into long-term memory that is the problem. So that constant reinforcement and then giving them the opportunity to practice until they can get it into a long-term memory becomes a very powerful tool. And what do we see typically happen? Kids are sent home with brand new work that they've never seen before, with instructions like read the chapter and do the questions at the end. Or we're going to move now into the next stage of mathematics. I want you to read this and then do the work. They're sent home to do work that they've never seen before. What do? They wind up practicing inefficient strategies as a result of that. That's a totally failed instructional paradigm that is very, very common in most academic settings. The use of direct instruction winds up being a powerful tool because it's scripted for teachers to use. It's very careful in terms of the steps that are included, and we see wild success for children who are both intellectually delayed, emotionally disturbed, as well as typically developing children if the direct instruction strategies are used in the classroom. And now let me jump down to the heavy hitter. Mnemonic training. I promised you I would cover this. Mnemonic training with an effect size of 1.6. That's 1.5 years growth in a single year. Man, if you can find an instructional strategy that's that powerful, then why not use that? Wouldn't that mean something? Mastro Prieri and Scruggs have done wonderful work in this area. And we're all familiar with mnemonic strategies. For example, we probably pass most of our college classes and most of our high school classes by the use of acrostics. Things like Holmes, for example, which is the Great Lakes. We use individual letters to give us cues as to the words that are in a list. Well, but those aren't the most powerful. The most powerful mnemonic strategies have been found to be visual pegs. So let me give you 2 quick examples and I'll be done. The first is in the use of a mnemonic peg for a science class. Students in a typical content area class at the secondary level, they might be asked to name all of the minerals on the mineral hardness scale. The mineral hardness scale goes from a 1 through a 10, with diamond being the hardest and talc being the softest. And for every one of those minerals, the student had to know the name of the mineral, its common color, they had to know its hardness level on the hardness scale, and they had to know its common usage. 4 pieces of information for every one of those minerals on that 10-point scale. So how did they teach it? They used a visual peg. What they did was they came up with a visual image for each one of those minerals. Now, this particular mineral that I'm talking about, that had a picture of a giant cartoon-like ape. He was what I call a Magilla gorilla ape, but that dates me, and most people don't get that. He was a very funny-looking ape. He was very large. He had on overalls and a derby hat. And is that a funny, novel image? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. And because it's novel, then the brain is more likely to remember it. Now, the ape is holding this large bag of fertilizer, and he's pouring the fertilizer over the top of a beehive. And the hive is swarming with bees, and the bees are coming all around the big ape's head, and he has a look on his face like, I am in deep, deep trouble here. Now, what's embedded in that picture? The name of the mineral was apatite, A-P-A-T-I-T-E. Ape serves as a phonemic peg to appetite. Apatite is brown, the ape is brown, the fertilizer is brown. Apatite is commonly used in the making of fertilizer. And we teach the kids peg words. 1 is bun, 2 is shoe, 3 is tree, 4 is door, 5 is hive. See, it's a 5 on the hardness scale. Embedded in that one visual image are all 4 pieces of information that that child needs in order to be successful. Now, what does the research show about the effectiveness of mnemonic training besides giving us wild success in the classroom? You know who gets it the best? Gifted kids. And you think, oh, well, of course, they get it. But you know who gets it equally well? Learning disabled children and children with intellectual delays. And my question winds up being, if children who have learning disabilities and intellectual delays can get this style of learning equally as well as gifted children, then why do you need to separate them and pull them out into a separate class for learning? It isn't the place that you put the child that makes the difference. It's what you do within that place that makes the difference. We have tools that will be effective if we will simply use them, but most teachers are unaware of this information. And so now it winds up being, how do we support teachers in such a way that it can uniquely make the difference that will be effective for all children, regardless of what the symptomology of their behaviors are, within a general education classroom in a fully included setting? If we do that, I think we're going to see success with this population. So thank you very much.